Hello, this is Professor James Strickler, and this is a course in American government. This lesson is from Unit 3 about American federalism, and it's Lesson 5, dealing with national power. In this lesson, you'll learn about the source of national power, the pattern of ratification of the United States Constitution, which is actually relevant to national power, and you'll learn about the original size of the national government. Now, in this lesson, and in several previous lessons now, we've been building a model of American federalism. At the end of the last lesson, this model included the big gray circle here, which represented all the powers that people had in the state of nature to do anything they wanted. Then the large white circle inside of it representing the police powers, which were turned over or delegated to states by the people when they came out of the state of nature, which then left this thin ring of gray around the white circle, which represents those rights that the people retained for themselves, what are described as unalienable rights. These are things that the state would not have power over, but the people would decide for themselves. Now, this is the original delegation of powers when the states were created after the American Revolution. But as we've learned in a previous lesson, this delegation of power was eventually seen as not sufficient to address the common problems shared by the states around this time of the founding of the United States of America. Now, this was a difficult thing, but not an insurmountable problem. Because this generation had been raised to understand and believe in the teachings of the English philosopher John Locke. Remember, he's the guy that we've met several times in this course already, who theorized about the state of nature and the creation of government through popular sovereignty, in other words, the common consent of those who would be governed by it. Well, John Locke theorized that because the people are the ones that give power to the government, and they give it to do certain things for them, if they reached a point where they thought those things that they wanted done were being neglected or opposed or in somehow not being adequately addressed, that the power would then devolve back to the people to place wherever they wanted instead. So now think about this. What this means is, after that original delegation of powers to the states, if the people decided that they felt that their state governments were adequately addressing things, such as Shays' Rebellion that we talked about before, or such as trade with other states, things like that, they then could, if they chose to, take some of those powers from the state and give them to someone else. So that's exactly what we, the people, did with the creation of the United States Constitution. The people delegated powers to the national government that the states had previously held supremely prior to ratification of the United States Constitution. But this act of the people of plucking away some of the powers that they'd given to the states and turning around and giving them to the national government instead, according to politicians like Alexander Hamilton, required what he describes as an express act. Here he argues that it's a basic principle of, as he puts it here, confederated governments. In other words, governments built out of independent states. That whatever they've not expressly given to the federal head, in other words, the central government that they are creating, has to be reserved or retained by the members. And because the powers had already been given to the states, had already been delegated to them, the only way then to remove those powers from the states and turn around and give them to some new central government is by what he describes as an express act. In other words, it has to be clearly in writing that this power has been taken from one type of government and turned over and given to another. Otherwise, the government that it was originally given to can presume that they still have it, that it's been retained by them. So what this means within our system of government in particular can be seen in this diagram, which we previously created in another lesson to describe our federal system of government. This is American federalism in one diagram. So in our system of government, we've got represented here a few states and a central government the government of the United States of America, that do not entirely overlap each other. The states do not completely surround and have power over the national government, nor does the national government completely surround and have power over the states. Instead, while they overlap, and the Supremacy Clause, as we've previously discussed in the course, means that the national government wins in those places of overlap. While they overlap, most of their power is outside the control of each other. There's certain areas where the national government's going to be supreme. There's certain areas where the states are going to be supreme. But recall that this presented a problem that we described as divided sovereignty. Who's really in charge if they each have their own areas that they're supreme in? And at the time we said the correct answer to that, the way out of this conundrum of divided sovereignty, is to realize that neither of them is actually sovereign. Instead, it's we the people that are sovereign. And so we the people take some of the power that we would otherwise have in the state of nature and we give it to our state governments. And we take some of the power that we'd otherwise have in the state of nature and we give it to our national government. But then, when building this diagram, I had to add these lines between the various states. And this is to show the fact that as the state governments were created, they were created by the people just within those states. And it was the people within those states that then had to individually decide to give power to the national government, which they eventually did all agree to when they ratified the United States Constitution. But this couldn't be done collectively. You couldn't just have we, the people of the whole country, decide to take power from the states and give it to the national government. Because then you would have people, for example, in South Carolina and New York and Pennsylvania voting to take power away from the Georgia government. Well, the Georgia government had been created by the people of Georgia giving power to it. They're the only ones that could take power away from it and give it to someplace else. So while the Constitution was ratified eventually by all of the 13 states, it was done so individually. So at one moment, the voters in Delaware voted on whether or not to take power from their state government and give it to this new national government. And voters in Massachusetts got together and decided whether to take power from their state government and give it to the national government. And by the time the Constitution was actually ratified, there were still a couple of states that had not chosen to do this and were not yet part of this union. Even though collectively, by that time, 11 of the states had voted to accept the Constitution, and thus the people of 11 states had done so. The people of those 11 states could not presume to vote on behalf of North Carolina and Rhode Island to take power from their state governments and give it to the national government. Each state had to do it individually. Now, this is an important idea because in American federalism, as we build our model of it, it begins with the people turning power over to state governments, and then the people plucking some of that power from state governments through an express act to give to the national government. But it had to be the people, state by state, who did so. It was not the entire country acting collectively before the country even existed to do this thing. It was the people of each state individually doing so. Now, when they chose to do this, state by state, to approve the United States Constitution and pluck some of the power from their state governments and give it to the national government, how much did they take from their state governments and turn over to the national government? Well, James Madison, the father of the Constitution, argued that the powers given by the Constitution to this new national government, through the votes of these people in the individual states, are, as he put it here, few and defined, as opposed to the power of the state governments, which are numerous and definite, as he puts it. So what he's saying is that the police power that was given to the states is numerous and indefinite. It's this big, giant, broad grant of power. Hey, state, go do whatever you think is necessary to take care of people's health, safety, welfare, and morals. Just whatever it takes, go and do it. It's a general grant of power to pass whatever laws are necessary to take care of those big, broad categories of things. In contrast, the powers given to the national government were specifically enumerated, as we've discussed earlier in the course, and therefore are few and defined. There's a specific list in the Constitution of what powers were given to the national government. So now let's put this into this model that we've been building for the last several lessons of federalism in the United States of America. In particular, we're going to add to the model the delegation of national powers. So remember, the model begins with this big gray circle representing the powers that people had in the state of nature. Absolute freedom to do whatever they wanted as they saw fit. And then what happens is we add this big white circle representing the powers that then they delegated to state governments. And we've characterized these as the police powers that were delegated. But notice they didn't give all the powers they had in the state of nature. What was left to the people were their rights that they retained, that they kept, that they had authority over, not the state government. The state government wasn't supposed to infringe upon these things or bother them. And then through acting state by state, what the people did was they plucked some of this power away from the state governments that they had given to them and gave it to a national government. But notice that circle for the national government is much smaller than the circle for the state governments, because the powers given to the national government, as we said before, are few and defined, while the powers remaining in the state governments retained by them are numerous and indefinite, to use the words of James Madison. So there, within that circle then, we have that smaller gray circle, we have these few enumerated powers given to the national government. And the powers in the white circle we can now describe not just as delegated powers given from the people to the states, but we can also describe them as retained powers, powers that the states kept, even as other powers, as some of their powers were given to the national government. So, national power was very limited. And the reason it was limited, as we've discussed in a previous lesson, is because the national government was distant, foreign. It was not trusted by the people. Yes, they recognized that there was some necessity in creating one to allow the states to cooperate together, but they didn't like the idea of some new Congress they had created, full of representatives from other states telling them what to do in their state. So they wanted to give it only a very small set of jobs to do. They didn't trust it with more power. In contrast, the state powers were broad. They were these general police powers. Hey, state government, do whatever it takes to take care of people's health, safety, welfare, and morals. And they felt comfortable doing that because their state governments were close to them, familiar to them, full of the kind of people who were like them, who they felt they could trust. So now let's review what we learned in this lesson. Where were national powers previous to them being given to the national government? Were they held by the people, held by the states, held by the colonies, or held by the king? The correct answer is they are powers that were held by the states, that then the people chose to take from the states and give to the national government. How did the people then go about ratifying this Constitution, which took power from their state governments and gave them to the national government? Did they do it as a national majority? Did they do it state by state? Did they do it city by city? Or did the people not do it? The correct answer is that they did it state by state. Each state individually, I should say the people of each state individually, had given power to their state governments. And therefore, they were the ones who then had to take that power from their state governments and give it to the national government. Some voter from another state couldn't choose to do that for them. They had to do it themselves. Finally, what powers were given to the national government? Were they police powers? Were they numerous and indefinite powers? Were they few and defined powers? Or were they unenumerated powers? The correct answer is that few and defined powers were given to the national government. All the other powers that were given to government were kept or retained by the state governments. That does it for this lesson 5 about national power. The next lesson from Unit 3 will be lesson 6 about reserved power.